Hello and welcome to this In Conversation here at CNBC Africa. I'm Chris Bishop. Now, 75 years ago, the United Nations emerged from the ashes of World War II with a message of hope and unity for the world. This year, it probably faced one of its toughest tests, COVID-19, a pandemic that's claimed nearly 1 million lives. All of this at a time when the world is an increasingly divided and unequal place. What should the UN have done this year about all of this? Now, with me to tell us more on the line from New York, the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Amina Mohammed, who is also a former Nigerian cabinet minister. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here. Well, COVID-19, it's been compared to the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918. It's knocked the world absolutely sideways. How much do you fear for us all in 2020 and 2021?
Well, I must say at the beginning of the year, very much so, because as it came, an unprecedented health crisis, we suddenly found ourselves not just with the health crisis, but the socioeconomic impact after the shutdowns. And I think that was far more alarming because we were talking about a global crisis where every part of the world was feeling this one way or another. So incredibly challenged and, of course, concerned. But as I think we began to respond to the health crisis and acknowledge the socioeconomic crisis, I think that we are far more confident now that the world does need to know what it has to do. And what we really want is the political will to get behind that so that these urgent measures at scale can be taken on both sides, the health, the humanitarian, and the socioeconomic crisis that we have.
And with the 75th anniversary of the UN, there's been a lot of stuff written in the press, a lot of scathing things about the United Nations. I just quote one here. They're saying the coronavirus pandemic has underscored the failure of the United Nations to bring countries together to defeat it. How do you react to that?
Well, I think that first and foremost, the United Nations is at the moment in a really difficult place where its nations themselves are not coming together. We are convening, we are speaking in different formats, whether it's finance or health or otherwise. So I think we're doing the very best that we can do between the reality we have with political leadership and fragmentation and the aspiration to try to get everybody together. We have to continue doing that day by day. But having said that, I do think that the United Nations has been able to respond in the field as frontline workers in providing the equipment, all the equipment that's necessary for COVID itself in humanitarian settings, in country settings, in the millions. And had we not done that, we would have lost so many more lives. So I think we're doing the best that we can do in the circumstance that we have, and we continue day in, day out to try to bring that together. UN at 75, the General Assembly this week is part of that effort to bring people together.
But it seems that it never rains, but it pours on the world. I mean, at the same time, the UN's dealing with the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict at the moment. But aside from that, more insidious for me and more threatening is this almost inward-looking rise of nationalism that seems to be going on around the world at the moment. Again, it's very easy to say you should do something about it, but what can you do about it?
I think we continue to bring the implications of nationalism to everyone. With COVID, wherever it is, it's everywhere. And I think we need to understand that it is the global response that has to happen. Now, as a nation, of course, the leader's first obligations and responsibility is people or her people. Once that's happened, then you need to look outwards because it is beyond your borders. And it will come across, whether it is a health crisis or it is a socioeconomic one, where the world is challenged by this will eventually affect you. Now, we continue to convene as we do with finance, as we do on the ACT Accelerator, which is a mechanism that's been put together by the WHO and its partners to get a vaccine, the people's vaccine for everyone. It is providing those spaces, bringing the key governments together. And I will say 3-4 months ago, we didn't have as much traction as we do now on some of these issues. And you will see this week as we meet on the vaccine, as we meet on finance, there's a lot more traction to what we need to do in terms of support governments, particularly developing countries, emerging markets, those where we have large populations that have become vulnerable overnight.
One more quick question there before we move on. I mean, a lot of people are asking the question at the moment, how far is the world from getting a COVID-19 vaccine?
I think with the efforts that we're seeing, there's a lot of promise and hope. There's several on track, and everyone believes that by the beginning of next year, we should see a vaccine. But that's not just it. We need the diagnostics, we need the therapeutics. We know that we have to attend to the frontline workers, the aged, those with underlying causes first, and that will take 6, 12, 18 months. So we must manage the expectations of how this will happen. What's really important right now is to see that the funding gap of $35 billion is actually filled. And when we see trillions of dollars going into stimulus packages around the world, it's not for want of money that we're not going to get the vaccine. So we need to have that political will to bring those resources together. I hope we'll continue to see the commitments this week as we go to meet on the vaccine issues. But its implications. You widen the risk of more humanitarian crisis, which falls on the shoulders of women and young people and girls. And that's really sort of the future. And the future now, we need a response now to make sure that in the recovery to COVID, that we get it right as we are investing now.
How much store does the United Nations put in these rescue packages, which you can find everywhere from London to Johannesburg to the United States? There's a big fear that a lot of it's based around debt. And in the near, not too far future, we'll face a huge debt bubble, which could mean devastating effects for many economies.
Well, I mean, first of all, the debt crisis was already looming before COVID. It's exacerbated by COVID, but I think there are different approaches to debt. And one of them is to say, well, let's have the moratorium so you create the fiscal space for developing countries to address this. Not that they're not going to pay back their debt, but they need that fiscal space to respond to what it's doing to their economies right now. I think we will come at a time where we will have to look at debt restructuring. But for now, the big ask is that these countries that have debt is to ease it so that we can have that space to spend more on social protection programs, on getting kids online so that they're not missing school, and maintaining the health services beyond the COVID response.
How far back do you think the clock has been turned by this COVID-19 pandemic on the social development of the world that the United Nations has spent decades building up?
Well, we've just launched the decade, so I'm hoping that with the framework of the SDGs, we can stop that slide. But clearly, hundreds of millions of people will be pushed back into poverty if we don't stop that slide. And that's why it's so important for us to look at the financial responses that we need globally to help countries ensure that we don't lose those gains. We still have time, very small window of opportunity, but it's closing fast. And I hope that this year we will see those commitments so that countries can recover better from COVID, that we use it as an opportunity and that we don't allow COVID to defeat the efforts that we've had so far. But clearly they're very much at risk. I mean, children who are out of school today in the hundreds of millions, we have to put them back in school. Now, some are lucky enough to get back online. Others may never get back again. And that in itself would be a tragedy.
What is the UN going to do about this terrible inequality problem that almost every country in the world seems to be suffering from these days, but especially here in Africa? I mean, during the pandemic, we covered many stories here on CNBC Africa talking about how people were working from home, how people were going to school from home with the help of the internet. But as you know, 2/3 of the African continent isn't connected to the internet. So it brought into really heavy focus the fact that there was one story for people who had money and another story for people who didn't have money.
Well, I think it's you just mentioned that this inequality across the world. Here in New York, we saw that in access to health services and also to education. In developing countries, it's even worse. And this is why we're saying that the stimulus packages are really important there, and that we can address the inequalities, because the opportunity of COVID is to get to everyone, because it's been a leveler where, everyone's locked at home. Yes, more access for those who are online, But this is the time where we can migrate informal businesses online. This is the time when we can put teachers online so that they are able to reach out to their students in different and innovative ways. But I think that the real concern that we have right now is that we know this, and we're already 5 months or so into this crisis, and we haven't seen the response that we need to see in countries. And we need to talk less about, what's happening, because we know, and more about what we're doing about it. And even when we make the commitments, those commitments have got to be delivered. And that's, of course, another challenge that we have. But with the United Nations, working with countries and their plans, so that investments can come, and there is a way to spend this money and to make sure that everyone is accessed, our women, our girls, those that are most vulnerable, young people especially, because this is a very trying time for them.
How big and difficult is this job you're facing? I remember during the peak of the pandemic, I sat through many a World Health Organization press conference on Africa. And one of the things that kept coming up was the fact that large parts of Africa, many people live in one house. Lots of people have to go to markets to earn their living. And each time the subject came up, people would say, well, it's something we must think about and it's unique to Africa. That's not really action in my book. What do you think the United Nations should be doing about that?
Well, I mean, it's not unique to Africa. What we found here is that Africa has, less cases that we have seen reported and less deaths. And I think that they have managed around the lockdowns. They have managed around sanitation and hygiene, and to really do an advocacy job that I think we would have seen much more had that not been the case, especially in the areas where we have, large slums outside our cities. So I think we are doing something right in Africa and supporting governments there to look at the testing, to look at the sanitation, the masks, the social distancing. And maybe, our compounds are the bubble for us. And that, I think, is important. The markets, of course, are a great challenge. I've seen many instances where they've tried to reduce the numbers and also to have 3 days a week or 2 days a week, so that, one is trying to keep a fine balance on what is, quite frankly, a choiceless choice. Do you go to the market or do you not put food on the table?
And that's the thing, and that's the huge infrastructure and financing gap this continent faced. And until that's closed, a lot of people are still going to be exposed. I mean, how would you propose closing that gap and getting more investment into the continent?
Well, this is already on the table. It's something that the Secretary General has made a call for since May, where we put 6 ideas around the debt, around liquidity and the SDRs, special drawing rights of the IMF that could be increased, and so therefore provide resources to developing countries. We've also looked at the illicit flows and governance around taxes. These are huge amounts that are actually flowing out that could be flowing in. And to say, that we also need to look at remittances, which are impacting many countries. So we do have a slate of options, which will be put in front of heads of state for the second time tomorrow. And we're hoping out of that, those political commitments can feed into the annual meetings of the IFIs, but also into the G20 meeting in November. So we continue to plug away and to convene and to take the messages and show the implications of inaction, which is, a huge, the cost of it is unimaginable if we don't take those decisions now.
And this is going to become more of an uphill task. I mean, you saw the other day, one of our presidents, President Cyril Ramaphosa, was speaking to the UN General Assembly, saying that all the money that had been diverted from very strained coffers here in South Africa was being taken away from a lot of the development goals that the country was committed to. Surely that must be a big concern for you.
It's a very big concern, and he's absolutely right. And this is why we say we need to find, the support to developing countries so that we avoid that. As I've said, this is a borderless world today. What happens in South Africa will eventually affect people in Europe and in other places of the world. So this is not just a country's, this is a global issue. And I think anything that is taken away from the Sustainable Development Goals today, we will pay for in a much higher price in the very near future. You won't even have to wait that long. for paying that price. And so I think it's in one's enlightened self-interest to make those investments. And it's not that they're not possible. We're talking about over 11 trillion in stimulus packages that has gone out over the last few months and continues to go out.
But do you see this altruistic school of thought in the Northern Hemisphere countries? At the time when the World Health Organization was grappling with COVID-19, they said, oh, this isn't an African problem, this is a world problem, it's going to affect everybody. But all we seem to see here on the news is more and more self-interest, more and more inward looking from the richer nations in the Northern Hemisphere.
I think some of that is changing very slowly. You will see this week that some of our countries are coming back again to invest in the COVAX facility, which is for the vaccines. They were not doing that a couple of months ago. They were being very nationalistic, but you're going to hear a few of those countries that will be making these commitments now. So I think we are making some headway. It is too slow, absolutely. But you have to keep plugging away because there is people's lives at risk, and that's what really matters. And that's where I say that the reality is pretty miserable today. And we have an aspiration to make sure everyone is addressed. We just have to keep plugging away at that gap every day, trying to close it.
And speaking about misery, I mean, for many, many years, yourself and the United Nations have been talking about increasing the equality of women, in bettering the lot of women in Africa. It's sad to say, during the lockdown, that's one of the great concerns countries had, was that a lot of women in the lockdown were going to be vulnerable to violence, vulnerable to all kinds of terrible things. Surely, after all these years of campaigning for a better lot for women, surely it must disappoint you greatly.
It does, because we've seen a spike in the gender-based violence as a result of lockdown. So many women imprisoned with their abusers, and we've also seen more child marriage. We've seen more poverty in homes, and so of course that does worry us. But we've also seen many more programs now that are where you have a gap in the budget and a stimulus package, that we're able to put funding in for that. In humanitarian settings, we're able to repurpose some of the resources we had for other issues that are no longer taking place because of the lockdown, focused on that. And I think that this is important, that we don't stop the push against much of the gains that we're losing very fast. We are concerned, but the policy briefs that have been put out to put the priorities back on the table, the plans, but a plan is only as good as it's invested in, and that's what we're calling the international community to, that these are investments in their own interests. This is not charity. And I think that this is where we need to really amplify that call to our leaders around the world to make sure that we have these investments.
And what would you say to some of the desperate women of Africa who have maybe been abused at home, they don't have a job, they don't have economic power, maybe some cases don't have education? A lot of people are crying out for change. What's the United Nations going to do for them?
Well, the United Nations is going to support their governments to do for them. At the end of the day, what the government does for people is what counts. That's where the resources are, but those governments need support. And so for us, we will continue to amplify and put a light on those that don't even appear in the investment plans that we see in some of our countries. So one is to bring forth that there are these issues, where they are, using the data to highlight where they all are. But let me just say here that, this is the one time that we've seen an extraordinary demonstration of women's leadership around the world. And that includes Africa, from young women to women ministers who have been there, to foreign ministers who've been there making decisions and moving some of these issues forward. So it's also a good time for women's leadership. We are seeing more women out there, women rising to the occasion, whether it's the economic frameworks that they're challenging, or they're actually opening up the space to make sure, yes, we deal with COVID, but we also make sure other health services are available. And I think that this is happening across the continent and across the world.
And during this difficult time, I mean, it's very interesting what you're saying about some of the signs. I mean, what gives you sort of that hope to cling on in what is going to be a very, very difficult decade for most people on this planet?
Well, I think all of us understand that hope means giving hope and assuring that you keep that light going in dark places is absolutely critical. I don't think we have an option. It's about a person's life, and one person's life is important. And so we want to make sure that the millions that are at risk don't end up falling behind or perhaps even losing their lives. For me, there is hope because the solutions are here. There is hope because the resources are here. There is hope because we are seeing more and more young people take leadership and have the energy and the vision. Where I have great concern is whether we have the political leadership that will rise to the occasion at a time when they are most needed, and give hope to those millions and billions that are waiting for them to act. We will continue to convince them that it's in their own interest to do so. And in some cases, I've said, we've seen much better responses, but it's not enough, and it needs to happen now at scale urgently.
Where do you think, I mean, you've worked in cabinet in Nigeria, but where do you think African political leadership is falling short?
I think I mean, first of all, I have to commend African leadership in the response to COVID. This could have been far worse. But I think if African leadership needs to do even more, it is with trying to ensure that there is more peace, that the conflicts that we have are resolved, and that we put more attention onto mediating those conflicts and bringing them to a place where we have peace, that we can invest in sustainable development because there is stability that we can pursue. And remembering that this is where we lose our young people and we lose our women to conflict, because there is nothing else in that environment. We're seeing good signs. It was a really good steps to see that we had a president and a prime minister sworn into office in Mali. And I hope that transition to democratically elected leadership in the coming months will come to fruition. So I think African leadership in resolving the problems on the continent, so that we have much more of an opportunity to attract investors to invest in our future, invest in sustainable development, invest in young people and their jobs and their future.
Well, speaking about COVID-19 and African leadership, one of the stories, unfortunately, of this continent as well is that a lot of the political leaders were actually leaving the continent to go and get medical treatment in other continents because their medical services at home weren't up to scratch. Do you think the day that's no longer the case will be a big step forward for this continent?
Well, I think that we've seen some African leadership, regardless of going across their borders for it, didn't help. I think many more leaders than not are actually focusing at home, improving those systems, because they've suddenly realized that if it doesn't happen, as we said, COVID comes across your home, the threshold, the borders, and you know, everyone's affected by it. It doesn't know whether you're rich or poor or you have access or not. And as the world started to lock down, there were not those flights that were available to many before to seek medical treatment elsewhere. And I can see many initiatives across Africa where health systems are being improved to tackle COVID, but also struggling to find the budgets to the existing health services, whether it's maternal health or vaccine programs. That has been a struggle. But I'll take you back again. These require stimulus packages. There are fiscal gaps. The resources are around in the world. The commitments need to be made at scale, and those commitments need to be delivered. All of that needs to happen yesterday.
What about looking to tomorrow? What about the African Continental Free Trade Area? It's still slated to start in January 2021. It's been called the story of the century here by Finance Minister Tito Mboweni. But how do you think it's going to fare? Again, with COVID-19 still hanging around, but also some of the shortages in coffers that have been created by COVID-19.
Well, it will clearly be impacted. I mean, that's why I think, you know, it is urgent that we don't reverse the gains of really good programs that have been launched by the African Union. It is a great program, and I think countries were all vested in it. I still think that in the response that we have today, provided we are able to find the fiscal space, that we can respond now and recover in a way that we jumpstart the Continental Free Trade Agreement. I think this is going to be important, and I think that many of our heads of state, ministers of finance, are looking at this together with the support that they're having from the Economic Commission for Africa.
And what do you think it could do for investment, you think, on the continent if it does manage to build up to full speed in the next year or two?
I think we'll see a lot of investments coming our way. As I said, there's a new cohort of young people around the world, much more courageous and connected, because that's the way the world works today. I think those investments will come. It's one of the reasons why we talk particularly to the private creditors as we look at the financing for development beyond the era of COVID. Is to show that these pipelines of investments do exist and that we can resuscitate them where there has been a pause on them now because of COVID. But in spite of COVID, see the opportunity of COVID. And I think that, people are becoming far more conscious about what that investment package looks like as they put it forward, far more inclusive. And, I think this is a push that the United Nations has when they do engage with governments, is to make sure that we aren't leaving any cohort or constituency behind in trying to reduce the inequalities and ensure more inclusive economies.
And finally, looking to the future of your own organisation, you've probably been reading the papers the same as me the last few days. There's a lot of calls for reform of the UN, people saying it needs to modernise, people saying it needs to change its focus. What do you think's needed?
I do think we need to be more fit for purpose. That's very apparent, and it's one of the first things that the Secretary General took up when he came into office. We've done that on the development side, we've done that on the peace and security side, and on management. It continues to be a work in progress, but the real reform is the response that we have at the country level in a much more joined up way, in addition to bringing the partnerships that one now needs. And, what we do is convene. And we convene to try to make sure the partners that are around the table are not just talking about the issues and the priorities, but are bringing those investments to be. So there has been new leadership. There has been a refocusing of the way we deal with business. If you look at the climate strategy that the Secretary General has, the coalitions that came out of our climate meetings last year, really focusing now on how to do these transitions with our governments post-COVID. Many of them, the opportunity, as I said, of have us a stimulus package. How can we transition, just transitions to greener energy, to making sure that there are greener jobs, that there is more connectivity. So yes, reform, that has to be, because you cannot use the tools of 1945 for 2020, and that's what we're trying to change.
And lastly, very briefly, just to hark back to President Ramaphosa's speech to the UN General Assembly the other day, he was calling for the day that more African nations are going to be on the UN Security Council. When do you think that's likely to be?
Well, I think we all hope that it would have been before today. So as we say in Africa, the struggle continues.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. That was the United Nations Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, talking to us there from New York. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on this edition of In Conversation here at CNBC Africa. From me, Chris Bishop, it's goodbye.